And well, I wanted to take this opportunity to share my new book with you, which, well, as you can see here on the slides, is called The Low-Carbon Contradiction: Energy Transition, Geopolitics and the Infrastructural State in Cuba. And it came out in the autumn with the University of California Press. And basically it's about quite a dramatic history of attempted energy transitions. Most of them failed, to be honest, and the politics of them. But then I put a slightly different title for this talk, because I've been really inspired by sort of the prospect of speaking to you in the Center for Energy Ethics, and I've started to think much more carefully myself in preparing this what that term might imply. So I thought I'd sort of start off by putting the book itself in some context, but then I want to frame it in a slightly different way from what I normally do. And I guess sort of in all books you will have sort of the main themes and arguments, but also the various subplots. And so when I started to think about energy ethics, I decided that I wanted to pick up on one of those sort of sub-themes, not least to hear your thoughts on them, because this is clearly an area where I think I could think much further myself. So I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion. And well, in short, it's around, well, how might we understand energy efficiency as both a cultural or ethical phenomenon and as a physical, even thermodynamic process at the same time, and with an important interplay between those two kind of social, natural, political, ecological dimensions. So I hope that sounds good as a declaration of intent. So first then, to put the book in some context. About 20 years or so ago, there was a new kind of report that started coming out. Or maybe it's actually better to say it's like a new kind of statistic were coming out in reports. And it turned out that these reports were, I think, as interesting as they were controversial. And the first of the kind that I came across was in the WWF's Living Planet report from 2006. So what they had done was to create a graph where they, on one axis, put just a conventional measure of human development. I hope you can see this, but this is the UN's Human Development Index. And on the y-axis, they put a measure of environmental impact. So here you have ecological footprints. And in doing this, they also introduced two threshold lines in the graph. So they put one at a HDI of 0.8, which then, according to the UN, indicates that if you're above 0.8, you've achieved a very high level of human development. And they put another line at an ecological footprint of 1.8, which at this time was the planetary boundary for sort of land use. Although I guess no one really talked about planetary boundaries back then. So this split the whole graph area into 4 sections. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that they marked the area blue. So here you would have a very high level of development and an ecological footprint within the planetary boundaries. And so they wrote here that, well, if you're in this area, you meet the minimum criteria for sustainability. And well, what made this graph both interesting and controversial was that there was only one country in that blue area, and that was the socialist state of Cuba. Now, if we look at more recent data using the same model, we can actually see that the picture looks similar. And well, this graph I made together with Alex Loftus for another book, and it says the same thing. We just put the threshold at 0.7 rather than 0.8. And in 2017, it turns out that using this sort of model, no country was sustainable. But it's really interesting to note that it's not the usual suspects that score well in these matrices, like Norway and Switzerland, that usually turns up really highly in these scores. But it's countries like Ecuador and Cuba, and Costa Rica always does really well, and Sri Lanka, and we can see the Dominican Republic and so on. So it's not the countries we tend to think about, at least not that I tend to think about when it comes to doing well in development terms, that turn out really well in these metrics. And if we look at the wide literature in especially ecological economics, there have now been several studies published that try to do the same thing, just using different sort of measures of environmental impact to come up with the same kind of indices. And the results obviously differ between these studies depending on the metrics they use. But it's the same 10 or 15 countries that tend to end up in some order in the top 10 to 15 or so. I should also say, sort of before moving further, that I think it's really important just to highlight and to be very explicit about how these indices, they're very simplifying. So obviously, if you would insert a variable for political freedoms in this, well, Cuba would probably score quite poorly, at least in sort of liberal democratic terms, whereas a country like Costa Rica would probably be number one. Or if you would insert a variable for socioeconomic inequality, well, probably Cuba, at least historically, would fare really well in that index. But sort of with those caveats in mind, if we try to continue following the argument, clearly a country like Cuba, something interesting must have happened in the country for it to score like this. And well, I found it really striking that Cuba is often held up in degrowth debates as a country that has experienced this kind of real-life successful case of degrowth. Just to give you a few examples, so you have someone like John Urry, the late great sociologist. He's written about a Cuban energy miracle. And degrowth scholars like Sebastian Boelat and colleagues, they've written about a real-life experience of degrowth. You might know of Jason Hickel, who's one of the most sort of leading advocates of degrowth. A few years ago, he developed a new, we call it a sustainable development index, which he tried to base on some degrowth assumptions. And initially, when it was computed, well, Cuba again came out as number one in the world. And I think after the last update, it's around place 5 or so. And so how can this be the case? How can they talk of Cuba in this in these terms? And I think this graph sort of tells the story in quite a neat way. So what you can see here on the screen is a graph of Cuban oil supplies or oil imports from the revolution in 1959 until 2019. And well, if you go from the revolution up until the end of the Cold War, so oil consumption increased in almost linear fashion in Cuba. So what happened was that they imported oil from the Soviet Union in return for sugar. And essentially the whole socialist project was based on this oil in kind of metabolic terms. So like all electricity was produced from it, all transports dependent on it. When they mechanized the sugar industry, well, it became heavily dependent on this oil. But then, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War geopolitical order crumbled. And, well, this happened. And in a period of around 3 years, Cuba lost access to more than 85% of all its crude oil supplies. And so the 90s and 10, 15, 20 years onwards, you had a really deep energy, but also economic and social crisis in Cuba. And, well, this is the period where those claiming that this is Cuba has gone through a period of successful degrowth, this is the time they speak about. This upwards trend here again, that's sort of the emergence of Venezuela and Hugo Chavez in world affairs, when Cuba started getting oil again in return for medical doctors. So from this graph and from this literature, clearly there's sort of good reasons to argue that Cuba has gone through a period of degrowth. But, well, to me, this is where it gets really interesting. Because having spent quite a bit of time in Cuba, it's very rare to hear anyone speak of the 90s as a period of successful degrowth. So if you speak to Communist Party officials, well, they will usually emphasize like how remarkable it is that the socialist state has survived in spite of the Soviet collapse, in spite of this big energy crisis. And they will try to emphasize sort of how Cuba has tried to return to a path of socialist development. And some even make a case for kind of an eco-socialism developing in Cuba due to large investments in renewables. Most Cubans, though, if you talk to them just sort of in their homes or in the street or wherever, they will tend to remember the 90s in a very different way, which is as this kind of intense time of hardship, massive energy crisis, a lack of food, lack of soap, lack of fuels. Many Cubans, of course, fled to the US during this time. And the all-dominating term for this early post-Soviet period among Cubans is the special period. So the special period, it's like a term that allows them to insert and rationalize experiences of this crisis and of austerity in a much longer historical trajectory of revolutionary change. So on the one hand, there is this narrative of a Cuban energy miracle. And then on the other, there's also these radically different ways of narrating Cuba's special period, whether it's a time of intense hardship or the emergence of an eco-socialist paradigm. So in the book, just to kind of set up the premises here, in the book, on the one hand, well, I'm trying to understand how this kind of enforced low carbon situation was experienced and narrated and negotiated from within Cuba. And then kind of through that long-term in-depth ethnography, I'm also trying to think through how we might understand proposals for a radical energy transition based then on the Cuban experience. So what does it say about transitions and their geographies, and what does it say about degrowth and eco-socialism as these alternative radical paradigms? And well, this kind of boils down to three themes or questions that weave through the book. So the first one is, well, what does the Cuban experience say about debates around degrowth and eco-socialism? The second theme or question, well, so how has then an imaginary of energy use and development been placed in Cuban politics? And how has that or those imaginaries also been renegotiated? And I'm looking at government, households, workplaces, and universities. How have those imaginaries been renegotiated in different periods then of geopolitical and environmental change? And the third theme is, so what does the Cuban experience say about the conditions of energy transitions, with a focus on some of the geographical implications in particular? And I'm mostly interested in sort of the political geographies of it. So here you have the kind of wider context of the book. And what I wanted to do here in this sort of talk with you now, being in the Center for Energy Ethics, is that I want to zoom in on an argument which is probably most strongly linked to the second of these points, to get to these questions around energy efficiency and energy ethics, or at least sort of give you a taste of what these questions might be in the Cuban context. And so to do so, I'd like to take you to a very particular moment in time, which was the early to mid 2000s, when the Cuban government launched what they called the energy revolution. And well, the energy revolution, it was a large nationwide political campaign. And I think one of the most important and interesting outcomes of it was that the energy and the carbon intensity of the state economy decreased by more than a third. So it was sort of quite a feat of decarbonization in that way. And there's a lot you can say about the energy revolution, both in terms of context and sort of the various aspects of it. But the one thing I want to sort of focus in on is a thing that, well, it really did contribute to that decline in energy intensity. And it was a public appeal from Fidel Castro and other political leaders for what they then in Cuban Spanish would call ahorro, which basically means saving, or in this context, energy saving. So you can see several images here of sort of billboards and murals that they put up across the country, just calling on the population to save energy. So this one, for example, it says, in your consumption, saving counts. And this was made by the state utility. Or this billboard says, a revolution with energy. Saving more, we will have more. And in political speeches and in TV ads and like workplace seminars, over and over again, the government was encouraging people to save energy and work more efficiently. They made stamps of the energy revolution, and well, later on, a picture of it was even put on a banknote. So they placed it next to these other milestones in Cuban revolutionary history. So the energy revolution was on a par with the anti-colonial battle against Spain, and Che Guevara sort of leading the rebel army in the momentous Battle of Santa Clara in 1958. So you sort of get a sense of how important the energy revolution was within official Cuban discourse. So why did they do this? Well, so the government and Fidel Castro in particular, they were voicing several different reasons for why energy efficiency was so necessary. And it had to do with economics, both for the state and for households. It had to do with the environment, had to do with load balancing in the national grid, and several other quite important reasons. But one of them was a moral argument. And so the government argued that it was the moral responsibility of the Cuban people to be thrifty and to work rationally and to ahorrar, so to save energy. And just to kind of bring the argument full circle, I think I need to give you some more context about the ideological framing of the Cuban Revolution, sort of the master narrative of Cuban socialism, just for it to make sense. And so one of the most frequent words you will hear in Cuba by just being there is, surprise, surprise, the revolution, la revolución. And basically, the revolution, it can mean three different things depending on the context people say it in. So first of all, it can denote the 1st of January 1959, which was the day when sort of the revolutionary movements entered Havana. So it's a point in time. The second thing is to refer to the period coming after that date. So in this sense, it refers to an epochal shift. So there's a before and an after the revolution. And well, in the period after the revolution, there are qualitatively different conditions of possibility for development to take place in that period. And then the third meaning, which is probably the way it's used most frequently in everyday speech. And this is to refer to all of Cuban society and all Cubans as part of an ongoing historical process. And so in this sense, well, all Cubans are currently living in and as part of the revolution. And well, the revolution can do things, and there can be revolutionary progress and revolutionary setbacks. And so this means that there's a strong sort of ethical or moral aspect of the revolution. Because in order for it to be successful, well, people also need to struggle for the revolution. So they need to fight and resist and sacrifice. And there's been quite a lot of work done on this from both anthropologists and historians. Now, what I'm arguing is that during the energy revolution, the idea of energy efficiency was inserted into this narrative of struggle and sacrifice. So by working efficiently and by conserving energy, you were in fact understood to be providing momentum to the revolutionary process. So energy efficiency was this morally charged kind of revolutionary virtue. And well, if we kind of run with this logic, so by being thrifty and efficient, Cubans were also ideologically called upon, or I guess like interpolated, if you wish, as these good, true revolutionaries. And well, I think we can anchor the argument theoretically to sort of see the larger scale impacts of it. So, on the one hand, energy efficiency is obviously this kind of technical or thermodynamic process. So it's a quantifiable phenomenon of just reducing heat losses in transmission or using less fuel or electricity for the same output, or using more efficient generators or appliances. So it's really a concept of physics. So energy efficiency, it sort of comes into being as this object of knowledge through measurement. But then, on the other hand, well, clearly it's also a cultural or even ethical phenomenon. So in Cuba, efficiency has been about identity and about notions of progress and political efficacy. And, well, I think we need to understand these two dimensions. So the thermodynamic and the cultural, not as two separate concepts, but as kind of mutually reinforcing ones. So we need to examine how the physical and the ethical interact to produce various economic and political and environmental outcomes. And for me, it's been really productive to read Andrew Barry's work around this, when he argues that, well, we should in fact understand the act of measuring energy conversions and energy efficiency as an explicitly governmental and political matter, as he writes. So I'll give you one final example just to see what this might look like in Cuban practice. So if you look at the historical record, you can see how the Cuban government very actively has tried to increase sort of popular trust or political efficacy by appealing to efficiency gains. So the logic is that, well, if the government can demonstrate how it increases energy efficiency, well, then culturally this sort of translates into how the government also is contributing to revolutionary progress. So in these very precise measures of, well, saved kilowatt hours or saved grams of fuel, it sort of makes visible how the government is in the struggle with the people and how it's successful in that struggle by saving energy. So in 2006, for example, well, Fidel Castro, he gave this big speech and he reported that the energy intensity of the state economy had decreased by about 15% in the first quarter of that year. And so in that context, I would argue that this piece of sort of thermodynamic knowledge, well, it translated into a much wider understanding of progress. So energy efficiency, it sort of did political work and it did ideological work. And I guess the follow-up question then is, so what work does energy efficiency do in, say, a Scottish or a UK or a Swedish context? And so that's sort of one area then of the book where I'm trying to extract lessons for how might the Cuban case tell us something about energy transitions and the wider politics of them. So I guess just returning back to where we started, sort of in the context of the book, this is how this argument might fit into that context. And I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.